So I have a short reading before I get started. This is from A Course in Miracles, chapter 19. The Holy Spirit has given you love's messengers to send instead of those you trained through fear. They are as eager to return to you what they hold dear as are the others. If you send them forth, they will see only the blameless and the beautiful, the gentle and the kind. They will be as careful to let no little act of charity, no tiny expression of forgiveness, no little breath of love escape their notice. And they will return with all the happy things they found to share them lovingly with you. Be not afraid of them, they offer you salvation. Theirs are the messages of safety, for they see the world as kind. There's a story about a man who carried 2 buckets of water from a well every day. One bucket was perfect, never lost a drop, but the other had a crack in it. And by the time the man reached his house, half of the water was gone from this bucket. And so for years, the cracked bucket felt ashamed of itself. It would think, I'm failing. I'm made for one job, the one job I'm supposed to do, and I'm failing at it. And one day, though, the man pointed out something that the bucket had never really noticed. Flowers were growing along its side of the path. And the man knew about the crack, so he planted seeds along the path on that side. And so every day, the bucket would water those seeds. The bucket thought it was telling a story about its failure, but the man knew a larger story. And knowing the larger story, I think, is the key to becoming resilient, especially in this uncertain and quickly changing world. Because resilience, in large part, is about the stories that we tell ourselves. And of course, you might reasonably ask, isn't just changing our story a form of gaslighting ourselves? And my answer to that is, yeah, it is. But we do it to ourselves all the time. I mean, we take enormous, bewildering collections of things that have happened to us, and we connect a few of those pieces together, and we create a story about what that all means. And then we tell that story to ourselves so often, it becomes something that we call reality. But here's the problem. We never know the whole story. We don't even have all the facts about our own lives. So we certainly don't know what's happening inside another person. We don't know every fear. We don't know every wound, every hope or limitation or circumstance that shaped that person, especially the person that we look at and think, you are the one who has hurt us, or you are the one who is hurting the world. We just see a few pieces. And then our minds just fill in the rest. And that's where our stories come from, everybody's stories. Henry David Thoreau put it this way: it's not what you look at, it's what you see. And what we see matters because the story that we tell about what we see determines what we're capable of doing next. When I was 9 years old, there were a lot of things happening in my family that I just couldn't understand. I didn't have the emotional vocabulary because I didn't understand adult relationships, so I wasn't capable of seeing the situation from the perspective that I have today. So my 9-year-old self needed a story to help me survive something that I couldn't understand. And the story that I found was a story that was shaped by anger. Because I told myself, well, that's the best choice you got right now. And it protected me. It helped me survive because it gave me somewhere to put my pain. And I told myself this story of anger well into my 30s. And then I realized that allowing a child's story to keep running my life, it was limiting the adult that I was becoming. And so I needed a new story. And I found one through Wayne Dyer, who I call him my gateway guru. But he has this story that he tells about forgiving his father. And the story, if you haven't read it, I suggest that you do a Google search on it because it really is quite powerful. And his story about finding his father and forgiving his father, it was very similar to the abandonment story that I had been telling myself. And it helped me see that forgiveness of my own father might bring about the same healing that Wayne Dyer had experienced in his own life. It didn't mean that what happened didn't matter. It didn't mean that I had to pretend that there hadn't been pain. It meant that I could stop requiring the past to determine my future. And honestly, that's what changed everything. I couldn't reconcile with my father in the ordinary sense because he died when I was 17, but I came to believe that reconciliation doesn't necessarily require someone's physical presence, because if we're all this conscious energy, whether we're in body or not, whenever we heal something within ourselves, I think that something in the world heals as well. And perhaps that's one way to understand what A Course in Miracles calls a miracle. A miracle isn't necessarily that some external circumstance suddenly changed. I mean, my father still left our family. And sometimes the miracle, though, is when we see the circumstances differently and we change our story about it. And because the story changes, we become capable of doing something different. We can forgive and move on with our lives. In the Gospel of John, Jesus says something to his disciples that I find remarkably compassionate. He tells them, I still have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them right now. And there are truths that we can't bear at one age that we can hold at another. There are things we understand only after maybe we've lived long enough. And so the 9-year-old me couldn't bear the whole story of what had happened in our family. And maybe that's true for many of us. Maybe some of the stories we carry were exactly what we needed at the time. The question is not whether those stories were wrong factually or whatever, whether they're self-gaslighting. The question about the story, the question to ask is this story still serving me? Because our stories don't stay inside our heads, they become the way we move through the world. When my life was centered around anger and grievance, that anger affected relationships. It affected people who never even had hurt me. It shaped how I interpreted other people's actions. And worst of all, it isolated me. But when I began to tell a different story, I became capable of reconciliation and forming healthier relationships. I was able to finally receive love instead of constantly preparing for betrayal. The story changed. And more importantly, as I changed that story, the community around me changed. And that's why I love this language from A Course about sending out love's messengers instead of the messengers that we have trained through fear. Because think about what happens when we go looking for evidence that somebody doesn't care about us. We find it because we are remarkably efficient at finding evidence for the story that we already believe. Someone doesn't call us back and we fear, oh, they don't care about me anymore. Somebody disagrees with us and we go, oh, they're against me. Somebody belongs to a political tribe that we distrust, and suddenly every flaw becomes evidence of their stupidity or their evil. Fear sends out its messengers and they come back with the receipts. But A Course says we can send different messengers. We can ask what else might be true. We can say, I don't know what's happening inside this person. We can say, this hurt me, but I don't have to turn that pain into hatred. We can protect ourselves without making another human being into a monster. And that's not denial, it's not gaslighting, it's discernment. But don't misunderstand me. I mean, there are times when we have to know that the difference between creating an empowering story and denying reality. I mean, if someone is harming us, we don't tell a story that says it's different and that they aren't. If injustice exists, we don't just say it's fine and we call it beautiful. If democracy is threatened, we're not pretending that the world's not on fire. Resilience isn't pretending that reality doesn't hurt. Resilience begins when we stop arguing with the fact that it does hurt. There's a kind of surrender that's necessary for resilience, not surrender to hopelessness, but surrender to what's actually happened. Someone we love has died. A relationship that nurtured us has ended. The job we relied on disappeared. The political moment that we're living through is real. It's real. And acceptance doesn't mean resignation. It means we stop spending our energy insisting that it should be something different. And when we do that, then we can ask that more powerful question. What do I want to do with what happened? And that's where our new story can begin. So how do we actually build these stories? Well, first we separate the event from our interpretation. I invite you in those moments when you're thinking about this, write down what actually happened, then write down what story you're attached to. I lost my job. That's an event. I am a failure and no one will ever hire me or value me again. That's a story. My friend didn't call me back. That's an event. She doesn't care about me anymore. That's a story. My father hurt me. That's an event. My life will always be defined by what he did. That's a story. The first statement is painful, and it's true. But the second story is a conclusion that can be changed. And second, ask yourself what your younger self needed your story to do, because sometimes the story we carried was brilliant because it got us through what seemed like an impossible situation. So instead of condemning that old story, thank it. And then ask whether it still belongs in your life right now. Finally, practice the question, what else might be true? Not what happy thing can I pretend is true? This is what A Course calls seeing it differently. Maybe the person who hurt you is also hurting. Maybe the ending of something is making room for something that you couldn't yet imagine. Maybe the failure that you're ashamed of is teaching you something that success never could. Maybe the person you've categorized as an enemy is more complicated than the little box that you have put them in. Maybe you don't know. Maybe saying, I don't know, can be a profound spiritual practice. Howard Hanger at Jubilee in Asheville was always fond of saying, there's more going on here than we can ever know or see. And that's not gaslighting ourselves. That's simply acknowledging that we don't know the whole story, and odds are we never will. So maybe we can just loosen our grip on our certainty about what everything means. And then finally, ask yourself, what story produces the kind of person I want to become? Which story makes you courageous or more compassionate or allows you to pursue justice without surrendering your soul to vengeance? Which story allows you to set boundaries about hatred without hatred? And most importantly, which one brings you back into relationship? Because every story plants something. I spent years planting anger. Eventually, what I had was a garden full of anger. It didn't nourish me, didn't nourish the people around me. It just produced more of itself. It just produced more bitterness, more anger. But when I began to plant stories around forgiveness, around love, around joy and reconciliation, something else entirely began to grow. My internal life changed. This is what I talk about, doing our internal work, and this is what this is. My relationships changed. My community changed. I found myself not surrounded by angry and cynical people anymore, but people who were forgiving and loving and joyful and reconciling. And I think this is where our spiritual work can become political, because the stories we tell ourselves about other human beings eventually becomes the world that we create with them. If our story is that everyone who disagrees with us is stupid or evil, then we're going to build a world organized around contempt. But if our story is that our opponents are redeemable, that they're more complicated than our judgment of them, or that our story is that justice and compassion can exist together, and we can oppose someone's actions without denying their humanity, or that reconciliation is possible even if we don't agree, that's when we start planting these different seeds. And that doesn't mean we abandon justice. It means we plant seeds of love that allow us to pursue justice without becoming consumed by hatred. Compassion doesn't require passivity, and forgiveness doesn't mean we don't draw boundaries. Marianne Williamson, who teaches A Course in Miracles, I love what she says. She says, you can love the drug addict, but that doesn't mean you give them the keys to your house. So there are boundaries. Sometimes forgiveness means releasing ourselves from the obligation to keep suffering the same injury over and over again in our imagination. Sometimes love means saying no. Sometimes grace means walking away. And sometimes resilience means staying. So I invite you to think about, what are the stories that you're carrying? Maybe it's about your family or your career or someone who hurt you 20, 30, 40 years ago. Maybe it's about yourself and your country. Ask if the story still serves you and what it might be costing you right now to keep the old story. And then ask, what's a more empowering story I could tell myself without denying what actually happened? We're not talking about spiritual bypass here. We're not talking about real gaslighting. You're not looking for a fake story. You're looking for a larger story, a story with room for forgiveness and complexity and uncertainty, a story with room for grace that allows you to become someone who can meet this moment without being imprisoned by the last one. Because resilience doesn't mean becoming invulnerable, doesn't mean that nothing will ever hurt again, and it doesn't mean that we always know why things happen. Resilience means remaining open to another interpretation, open to another human being, open to forgiveness and love, and maybe especially open to the possibility that the story isn't finished, because like that broken bucket, maybe in this moment, you just can't yet see the flowers that your life has been watering all this time. So I invite you, make it a daily practice to plant some new stories, to send out love's messengers into the world. When fear tells you that the world is nothing but enemies, take another look. When anger tells you that the past has to determine your future, look again. When grief tells you that nothing will ever grow here, take another look. And when your old story says, this is who I am, ask whether it might be instead, this is who I had to be then. And then ask, what might I become now? Because what you plant today becomes the harvest of tomorrow. And so the stories we tell ourselves become the soil in which we live. So let us plant stories that nourish us, that make room for truth without making a home of despair. Stories that pursue justice without worshiping vengeance. Stories that honor our wounds without making those wounds our full identity. And yes, stories, tell yourself stories that make you more capable of love, because that's the seed you want to plant. Because when that love grows within you, then it becomes a love outside of yourself that will make the whole world say, oh yeah.